In this episode, I'm going to be talking to Giacomo Zucco, a Bitcoin maximalist, and a really interesting guy that I've been following on Twitter for a while. You may notice that at the very beginning and at the very end, there's a little bit difference in audio quality because we had numerous technical difficulties, including a power outage right towards the end. So there was actually a little bit of editing and splicing of audio. Usually I don't like to do that, and I don't ever plan to do that in future interviews, but this just had to be redone. The intro and the outro segment had to be redone after it had already been done just because of these technical difficulties. Giacomo was a great guy. He was very understanding and was very gracious in his time, and what should have been probably been about an hour interview stretched on to a little over 2 hours. So I want to say thank you very much. I really enjoyed this interview. There were a lot of things, and I'll say it at the very end, that, and I wasn't being facetious when I said that there's a lot for me to think about, and that I wasn't becoming a Bitcoin maximalist yet at that moment, but there was a lot of thought-provoking arguments that I hadn't heard quite worded in a way that really struck me as when it did in this interview. So I really hope that you enjoy this interview with Giacomo Zucco. Okay, today we are interviewing Giacomo Zucco, director of BHB Networks. He's a Twitter instigator and Bitcoin maximalist. Giacomo, welcome to the show. Now, before we get into the meat and potatoes of this episode, tell me your Bitcoin origin story.
So basically, I met Bitcoin starting from 2010, and it kept coming out in very different contexts I was interested in. I was interested in technology for payments, and that was also part of my job because I was working in a multinational company as a technology consultant, mostly for payments. And so it started popping out in forums describing cryptography for payments and new payment technologies. Also, I was a diehard Austrian economic fan and gold bug. So I was all about the end of central banking, Ron Paul and the Fed, all this kind of libertarian, paleo-libertarian rhetoric, also very much into the study of free banking. And on a very separate note, I was starting to get very, very interested into privacy fights and privacy political issues like WikiLeaks and Tor and the global surveillance. I was starting to get interested into the question of WikiLeaks, Assange. So I was interested in Austrian economics and free banking since a lot of years, but I was interested in privacy battles and privacy activism just since very, very recently. But the interesting thing about Bitcoin is that it started popping up in very different contexts. So I was surfing these technology forums, and I heard about Bitcoin and I dismissed it. Then I was surfing gold bugs and free banking forums, and I heard about Bitcoin and I partially dismissed it. And then I started to surf about in forums about the dark web and Tor and privacy and WikiLeaks and Assange, and I started to learn about cypherpunk and crypto anarchist theory around 2010, 2011, and then basically I started to realize that it was popping up in very different contexts. And it was my wife, Mir, that told me in 2013, she told me, basically Bitcoin is the only constant in very, very different niche interests that you have, very different among each other. So you want to do technology, you want to do politics, you are like divided between privacy advocacy and free banking advocacy, and also you should make some money sometimes instead of just going around doing the political activist or the technology nerd, and so you should focus on Bitcoin. She told me that to me in 2013. I was already studying Bitcoin since 1 year, and it was very difficult for me to focus on anything else. So in 2013, I quit the the multinational company, and I started to participate to various Bitcoin-based businesses in very different fields, from payments to mining to consultancy to also to something a little bit more scam like blockchain-based timestamping to manage and to verify supply chain for wine, which we know right now doesn't make any sense with Bitcoin or blockchain. But I did experiment on that. Many of these ventures, they failed or they pivoted to non-Bitcoin stuff. But some of these ventures did pretty well. Like I worked very briefly, but at the very beginning with Lawrence Naum at the Wallet Green Address, and now this was the most advanced wallet around, and now it have been acquired by Blockstream. So very proud. Then basically in since 2013 to 2015, I started to do the serial startupper. And in 2015, it was not clear to me which was the best business model around Bitcoin. I started to basically create a venture in order to explore business models. So I created Blockchain Lab and BHB Network, which is a network of consulting companies and incubators, let's say, and a non-profit open source foundation, which has as goal to gather all the smart people and all the best startups together, provide them with free space, resources, venture capital investments, and jobs when necessary. And in exchange, I was getting a lot of information, and I was extracting, structuring, and packaging this information in order to sell it for financial incumbents, especially banks, especially in Switzerland. And this was my job for basically 3 years. So it was not a Bitcoin startup, but a meta Bitcoin startup, like a gathering of various startup. Financially speaking, it was not scalable. I did not make a lot of money. Indeed, I did use a lot of my money. A lot of my early both or mined Bitcoin has been spent in order to sustain this business. So financially speaking, this was not great. But from a personal development, a personal growth point of view, I am very happy about the choice, because I got to know many of the most intelligent people I ever met in these years, and they were great for me and my wife and all our co-workers and startuppers and experts. We created a lot of strong relationships, and of course we managed to have a privileged viewpoint over the Bitcoin evolution and final goals. So it was great.
So before we get into talking about small blocks, big blocks, I just wanted to get your, definition of like what is Bitcoin? Like what is Bitcoin to you, and what do you think that Bitcoin is to the world?
So I think that Bitcoin is one of the first succeeding experiments in sound money. So I would say ideal money, not in the sense of John Nash, but in a broader sense. So basically, money is a great technology, one of the first technologies invented by the humankind, and it's great. It solves a lot of problems with barter, double coincidence of wants, and it solves the problem of capital accumulation for investing and all this kind of stuff. Of course, money has to have a lot of characteristics, but these these features are sometimes in trade-offs one with the other. For example, gold was a great form of money, but it was not very easy to verify. That's why people started to use coinage in order to verify gold. But coinage was a centralized trust in some entity that was putting the image on the coin. So it was not perfect, because sometimes the centralized entity was tampering with the value of the coin, debasing it basically. So pure pieces of gold are better than coins. As for security from third parties as a security hole, but they were worse as for verification, because you need a hydrostatic scale in order to check the content of gold of your money. Also, gold is very difficult to transport. If you have to transport or to hide a lot of gold, you need a lot of space, and of course you can make something which is even more compact than gold as a density of wealth. But the problem there is that you are giving up divisibility. So how can you pay your coffee with platinum or even with gold? You can't. So that's why people use the silver. But then you have two metal standards, which is very difficult for which makes which builds up more friction and makes standards more complex to manage and economical calculus more complex. So basically, the monetary system evolved, but any time that we were getting some feature, some new feature, some new positive feature, we were also letting go some other feature on the other way. So basically, we arrived to fiduciary-based central banks based fiat money, which is based on the threat of violence of the legal tender and of the monetary monopoly. So it is the law enforcement basically punishing with violence everybody which is using alternative forms of money, and everybody who is not accepting that money for payment. And on the same side, you also have a pump demand because you are requesting that money for paying taxes, which is another form of aggressive violence. And the supply part of fiat money is a completely arbitrary decision by some central banker. So this is the outcome of the fiduciary based money, which was based on centralized institutions managing the money supply and the money management. Of course, the fiduciary, let's say, information theory based money, like a check, like a transfer wise, this is basically something that is better for portability, transferability, because you can send money with PayPal from Italy to Venezuela in 1 second technologically. Then you will need days in order to clear it from a bureaucratic and regulatory point of view. But technologically, fiat money can be transferred instantaneously and can be moved very, very easily, but it can be manipulated very, very easily. Like fiat money is usually debased even more than coins in the ancient times. So we have a problem of sound money. Our money right now is not anymore sound, is not hard. So there is no resistance to inflate the supply or to tamper with the supply, manipulating interest rates and causing economic crises. And also it's not private. So when I give you some piece of gold, I know that I'm paying you, you know that I'm paying you, and nobody else's business except for me and you. While with fiduciary-based money, and especially in the internet era, all this privacy is completely destroyed, and these fiduciary gatekeepers of the payment, so PayPal, Visa, MasterCard, or my bank, your bank, or the central banks, or the government controlling the banks, they are getting all our information about one of the things which is most sensitive for privacy in everything we do. So payment is more sensitive for privacy than our messages on Facebook or Twitter or whatever. Because with payment, I'm talking about the personal information about the disease that I have to cure buying some medicine, or my donation to some political cause that my boss do not like, or the ring I bought for my lover in not showing it to my family. So everything which is very, very personal passes through money. So the cypherpunks during the 90s, they started to identify the privacy of money as one of the most important privacy fronts ever. So Bitcoin is an attempt to answer both the problem of sound money and the problem of private money with the same tool, which is a decentralized money system. Of course, it's not easy to build it. So right now, Bitcoin is not super scalable as a payment system in the layer 1. It will be in the layer 2 and so on. And it's not very private because, it is private in a sense that it's pseudonymous, but it's kind of easy to track and cluster and taint and let's say de-anonymize by law enforcement agencies. So we're still not we still haven't concluded the experiment. The experiment just started, but if it's going to work, it will be one of the most exciting experiments in the history of technology and of economy and of society at large.
So I think that's a pretty good succinct explanation of Bitcoin, and really, so talking about small blocks versus big blocks for the people at home, really the history of it. I mean, it kind of started really early. I mean, Hal Finney, one of his first messages was that this thing really isn't going to be able to scale as it's designed, and it's been kind of one of those nagging questions, very early on in Bitcoin that kind of was just shelved, I think, for a while just because it wasn't an issue. And then, a few years back, it started to get a lot more, heated with proposals by, Gavin with Bitcoin XT and all that. And then it really kind of came to a head with the SegWit 2X coming up last year. And with that kind of being shut down, that kind of led to the first fork. Now there's, I don't know, there's probably like 100 of them now. But the first real fork in Bitcoin that was kind of a test case for how this thing was going to go. And so after that No 2X campaign and the fork into Bitcoin Cash, now we kind of have this split case in a way of seeing which side is right as far as for store of value or for everyday cash or whatever you want to call it. Which one's actually going to work? I mean, would you say it's a kind of a fair, brief assessment of the kind of a very brief assessment of the scaling debate in Bitcoin?
Yeah, I think it is. I will not. I know that this is a very annoying and I mean pedantic distinction, but if we are talking technically, I will not call big cash or big oil or anything else like that as a fork. So when we hard fork and soft fork and software fork are terms that are getting some kind of terminological consensus right now in the community. So right now, the consensus among people working on Bitcoin about the terms hard forks and soft forks is such that it is a hard fork if all the network accept to evolve the rules. So in that case, it's a successful hard fork. In the case of some network split, like the one of Bcash, which is basically the same thing of the creation of a new altcoin with an initial airdrop, then it's not technically speaking an hard fork because it's you can call it an failed attempt to hard fork that basically generated an altcoin with a distribution which is based on a UTXO based airdrop. So yeah, this is a pedantic distinction, but I think it's important to know what real developers are talking about while they are talking about hard forks. So Bitcoin did had a few hard forks at the beginning. It's not true that Bitcoin never hard forked. I used to think that that was the case, but I was wrong. So Bitcoin did pass through some hard forks in the Satoshi era, but not anymore since a long time. And Bcash was not an hard fork. It was the creation of a new altcoin. I can create an altcoin and distribute it on the base of the UTXO setting of yesterday, or I can distribute it half based on the UTXO set of yesterday and another half on the UTXO set of tomorrow. I can try to do any kind of manipulation, any kind of degree of airdrop style, but this is not that any altcoin that gets airdropped to the UTXO set of Bitcoin becomes a Bitcoin fork. So a Bitcoin fork usually is an attempt to fork off the rules of Bitcoin in a way that expands the rules. So except for this very, very brief, let's say, correction about the technical terminology, I would really consider your wrap up of the debate as fair. I would just emphasize something, which is basically that, as you said, Alfini itself weighted in about this debate very early on, like in the first days, and Satoshi himself did the same. And he initially was like more leaning to be in the other field. Like he was like dismissing the scalability problem at the beginning. Then he started to gradually admit that the SPV model that he had imagined was basically trusting the miners completely, and so it was a degeneration of trustlessness and of decentralization from the original design. This is not the only case in which Satoshi did a great job in coming out with Bitcoin. Whoever he is or they are, they were geniuses. But in some cases, they got the game theory partially wrong. For example, in the end sequence of code, Satoshi was thinking to create a payment channel, the same things that now we use in Lightning. Satoshi was already envisioning payment channels, but he was doing that based on end sequence. That was basically based on the idea that the miners will mine a transaction with a higher IC end sequence. Instead, the miners were not doing that. They were mining transaction with more fees for self-interest. So you cannot trust miner to enforce the rule. Miners are entrepreneurs. They can be easily corrupted by centralized governments. And Satoshi didn't even know the problems of ASICs, production concentration with Bitmain and all these kind of problems. So yes, there was a debate at the beginning, but the debate started with Mike Hearn and then Gavin Anderson and then Roger Ver and then Jian Wu. It was never, in my opinion, a real technical debate. All the technical knowledgeable people was always on one side of this debate. Many people think that inside this side there is a lot of disagreement. Like somebody thinks that 2 megabyte or 4 megabyte with SegWit is okay. Luke Dashier thinks that it's already too much. Adam Beck thinks that we should put some kind of automatic increasing block size, like the BIP 248 proposal from Adam Beck. Everybody is disagreeing, but nobody is disagreeing among technically knowledgeable people about the fact that a rushed hard fork, in order to keep artificially fees low with increase in adoption, just kicking the can along the road without any kind of second layer structure, is really, really, really a bad idea. Basically, everybody that studied the Bitcoin system enough knows that the same idea that you have every single transaction recorded by every single full node forever. So if you buy a coffee, an uncapped number of full nodes will have to record your coffee purchase in clear text on the blockchain forever. This cannot scale in any way. This is a obvious bad design. So this is obvious for everybody. Of course, the choose of the specific trade-off, like which is the best equilibrium between usability and decentralization. This is not easy to answer, and there is a lot of disagreement. But my final, I'm taking too long to answer. But my final consideration is that in my opinion, the 90% of the debate that ensued in these last years was not technical and was mostly ideological. It was based on a fraction between, let's say, a technocratic elite, emergent elite. So the experts that are very annoying for normal people because they are, they have an I know everything approach. They can be a little bit snobbish. They talk in a jargon that maybe not everybody understands. They make you think that hard trade-offs exist, so that real life have scarcity and you have to choose between user experience and decentralization. Why against these elitists, you have the populists like Roger Ver. They get their influence, their political influence, telling people that it's not a matter of choices or scarcity or trade-offs. Abundance exists for everybody forever. So there is like free stuff, free lunch for everybody forever. And the people that's telling you that you have to choose between one feature and the other, they are just lying to you. There is a conspiracy to tell you that there is some kind of trade-off so that they can control you or they can manipulate you. This is the typical populist vs elitist political debate. And I think that Bitcoin was, in these last 2 years, was afflicted and affected by this kind of political and not technical duality and dichotomy between populists and elitists. Of course, in this specific case, I think that the elitists are technically right, even if maybe their kind of style or behavior is not always the best PR strategy that you can imagine. But I don't think that I don't acknowledge any kind of technical merit in the, let's say, Bcash front.
So, listening to people, like Jameson Lopp, I've heard of, a couple podcasts and interviews with him. And there's quite a few other people within, the maximalist, I guess, community, that there will be a need for a block size increase in the distant future, whenever that is, after Lightning Network's fully implemented. We already have SegWit, Schnorr Signatures, all these other aggregators, have been fully implemented. We kind of run out of ideas for block efficiency. And then fees start to hit a point where it becomes on-chain, more difficult. And then you end up just, getting to a point where you have to keep everything on Lightning Network. If you're the average person. Do you agree with that statement that at some point, whether it's in 20 years or 100 years, there will have to be some sort of on-chain block increase?
So I don't agree specifically in the fact that it's strictly inevitable for the surviving of Bitcoin. I think that it's very, very likely and very, very desirable. I think that sometimes, someday in the future, we should have a blockchain increase. The problem with blockchain increase is, first, you should privilege full node operative cost containment over easy UX, because if you lose the decentralization, you are never going to recover from a centralization attack. While if you lose user experience and adoption, you can still have that adoption later if people really do need Bitcoin, and they do need Bitcoin, because otherwise our own premise is broken from the beginning. So if nobody needs a form of sound, decentralized, censorship-resistant money. So if this is the case, of course it will be a waste over, let's say, 20 years from now, when really the rate of increase of the Bitcoin blockchain will be relatively small compared with bandwidth and storage. Storage was never really a problem, but mostly bandwidth and validation computing power, even in worst case scenario. So Bitcoin must be resilient in the scenario in which everybody has to switch to Tor, everybody has to use VPN in order to overcome the Great Firewall of China. So there is like a bad situation geopolitical that makes internet not reliable anymore. So Bitcoin needs to be resilient as for number of independent validating nodes in the worst case scenario. When we will get to a situation in which block size, blockchain increase, blockchain rate of increase is negligible compared to the actual technology, especially related to bandwidth and validation, then for sure it will be a waste not only to have only 4 megabytes of theoretical maximum, that is what we have now with SegWit, of block space, but also to have 10 minutes of waiting time. So 1 over 10 minutes of block frequency is very, very low. It was a good compromise by Satoshi between user experience and decentralization. But if our technology allows us to have much more, it's a waste to have a base layer which has 10 minutes and 4 megabytes. Maybe we would like to have 5 minutes and 20 megabytes, or 1 second and 2 terabytes if we're talking about years and years in the future. The problem is that, so I think there is no question about that. The problem is that any kind of hard fork change in Bitcoin is very dangerous, because if you don't have 100% agreement, you have a split. and so you failed your hard fork and you are creating an altcoin. And also any kind of coordination, it's in itself a possible attack vector for external adversarials. So anytime you want, that's true even for Duke Dash's proposal about proof of work change. Anytime you want to change something in Bitcoin, you are creating a vulnerability, because if we don't coordinate, then we can split the network with many damages in our network effects. And if we do coordinate effectively, then this coordination can be the backdoor for adversarial to establish some kind of control over the network. So it's always bad to change Bitcoin. The nice thing is that block size increase, and I think also block frequency increase up to a point could be in the future emulated in the same way we did with SegWit. So basically, it's not necessary to have an hard fork in order to have a block increase and block size increase, and probably you can perform some similar trick in order to perform a block frequency increase. I always stress that, like, it's very funny for me to see the big cash people right now debating about decreasing the block waiting time or increasing the block frequency, because it's exactly the same kind of trade-off. Big blocks and fast blocks have the same UX benefits, kind of, and the same decentralization bad externalities, kind of. So I think that these two things are very, very, very related, very much related. And yes, I think that it would be nice at some point in the future to have not just the block size, but even the block frequency to be somehow dynamic. So not just increased once, but maybe made dynamic. It's very, very hard to find a good way to do that, because basically one idea is to increase them as variable as a function of time, but that assumes that technology will always grow at a certain rate over time, which we know from the ancient past is not always the case macroscopically. Sometimes the technology goes back after a war or some kind of geopolitical situation. We can have basically a decrease in bandwidth overall and in computing power overall. We can have unexpected problems, and also we can have plateau in the Moore's law. We can have some kind of fast growing industries reaching some kind of physical plateaus, so it's not growing as fast as we thought. So having a fixed function of time is dangerous. But having any kind of arbitrary voting system, like the miners will vote for increases or decreases, like the first Jeff Garzik proposal, that's also crazy, of course, because a block space or block frequency cap decided by the miners is basically a recursion problem. You have the same people you want to limit that are deciding on the limit. So overall, it's still an attack surface which is very, very, very vulnerable. So it's not clear to me how we could do that. One final positive note, though, about this possible future hard fork is that there are other reasons not related to hard fork, to block size, that will probably force us to have at least one hard fork in the future of Bitcoin. There is, if you read about SpoonNet research or other problems related with basically a new version of the Millennium Bag. So there are some problems that maybe we will not be able to solve with soft forks. If that's the case, then some hard fork in the future will be performed. And if that's the case, there is no reason to not include a reasonable block size and block frequency adjustment into that. Of course, it's always dangerous to change Bitcoin. So I prefer status quo over any kind of risky change. But if it's a not risky change, like SegWit, like I don't know now BIP, I mean the L2 SIGASH no input modification, or Schnorr signatures, or graph truth. If it's something that is not dangerous, of course we can have that change. So that's my answer. I'm not sure that it will be inevitable, but I think it's very likely. And I think at the center point, it is more than welcome. The problem is just that it's probably too soon now now we have more a problem of validating full nodes than a problem of people paying $5 to use a completely censorship resistant money transfer system of millions of dollars across the world. Is not such a big deal, even because right now in the monetization phase, Bitcoin is more for permissionless saving than for permissionless paying, even if it's also for permissionless paying in some context. So in this context, and with the second layer technology still developing, and also you can see that when there is need, you have basically smart people finding solutions. Like at the beginning, the problem was that everybody was supposed to open payment channel with everybody else, and that was still not scalable. That Lightning idea came in, so now you can just open a couple of channels and with everybody and route through everybody. But then it was still not perfectly scalable, so channel factories came in. So now one person can open a Lightning channel that will serve 5, 10 other people. But then L2 came in with multi-party channels. So now you can open a 5 or 10 or 16 parties Lightning channel, of course, after Sigash no input gets in production with L2 technique. So as you can see, there is always improvement. There is a submarine swaps. There is a lot of stuff that people is thinking about now, because the limitation of the base layer is improving ingenuity and a smart lateral thinking. So the short answer is yes, I do think that we will Hardfork to increase block size and block frequency in the future, but I'm not sure that's completely inevitable. And if the only way to do that is not safe, I will rather fight against any such a change.
My follow up was initially going to be, if you see it as inevitable or more likely, then why not now? But I think I kind of understand your answer to be it's not necessarily inevitable. It's if we're going to do that change, it's better in the future when we have a better idea of how this network's going to evolve, and when we have a greater network effect to counteract any kind of centralization that could happen with miners and in a smaller network with a smaller hash rate than say in 10, 20 years. I guess, one of the things is to kind of throw out where I sit on this is I'm kind of one of those wishy-washy fence sitters in a way, where I see, and I kind of feel for the reasoning behind people who are for the big blocks because of the ability their arguments for increasing adoption now. Mostly just because I'm becoming increasingly worried that, say central bank or corporate centralized crypto payment networks are going to beat us to adoption in a way, because, they have home field advantage, they have public trust, maybe not necessarily warranted, and they have an innate ability to incentivize adoption where, a quote unquote decentralized network may not have. And I think one of the major issues that we kind of have in this space, and less so that, you're kind of in the business field versus some of the other, folks that are kind of on the more technical side. But I think a major issue is based in this space is on ideological and technical mindsets. You have people like us who are libertarians. We understand, the value of sound money over fiat, and we really get why Bitcoin is so revolutionary. Unlike people like Peter Schiff, they're still stuck on gold. But most people don't get that. We've been talking about that. How gold is a much better than fiat for years. And in the end, they don't really care. And then on the other hand, you have kind of, the prominent folks in this field, like you said, they're technical folks, kind of this technocracy or, technocratic kind of folks who really get the nuts and bolts of how all this works. But I think one of the issues we really have here is kind of this lack of UX and UI development as well for these platforms. And that along with, people like things that look pretty and are easy to use. And they're also, just lazy. And I think if you gave the average person on the street a pretty app denominated in dollars, and then you gave them, a Bitcoin app that wasn't as pretty, but, has, the cryptographically secure, censorship resistant, all this sort of stuff that secures it, people are going to pick the pretty one, the easy one every time. And people really value their time. Uber exploded not because people hated taxis. I mean, I do think that Uber is better than taxis, but it exploded because you could sit on your couch, tap a few buttons, and wait until that same app told you to come outside. It really saved time, and time's really, when you look at what becomes more popular in culture and in business, it's always what saves time for the people. And I think, are all the things that make Bitcoin, secure, immutable, all these things important? I think absolutely. And I think they need to be, nurtured, as you said. And I agree totally with that. But will most people care if we don't make it so simple that a 5-year-old could use it? I kind of struggle with that. And I'm just kind of worried that we're going to end up hodling our Bitcoin. It's still going to have value. It's still going to be worthwhile, while at the same time, everybody around us is spending MasterCard coin or to get gas, or, at the same time that we're trying to get people who had no problem with fiat over gold to understand why Bitcoin is better than, say, Facebook token. And that's kind of one of the, my thought process, and why I kind of feel for the argument for big block for adoption in the immediate term. But on the other hand, I understand your in the maximalist argument against, don't do what Ethereum is doing. Don't do the move fast and break things because we can't really afford to. I mean, what are your thoughts on that kind of argument?
So I understand your thought process, but I really don't share it. I really debate that in an absolute way. So if you ask me, is it better to have a 1 megabyte block or a 3 megabyte block right now? My answer is I don't really know. It's a very nuanced topic, and I may be wrong or I may be right. But I have not a strong opinion. I have strong opinions about changing the rules with forks, with contentious forks, but not about the ideal block size. While on this reasoning that you just exposed, I have a very, very base level objection, which makes all these a completely non-issue, logical non-issue for me. So I understand where you come from with this, but I think that with some logical reasoning, you can easily dismiss this problem as a just an investment problem for Bitcoin hodlers or Bitcoin traders, if they have to sell their Bitcoin or not. But that's the only part of the problem. The libertarian and visionary part of Bitcoin are not at all affected by this issue, and I will try to explain why. So basically, you have three scenarios, three options, and I don't think you can find a fourth. So the first scenario is people around the world will eventually do need sound money and private money. So the reason that we are in this is that great part of the people over the world, rich people, want to do capital flights from China or from Italy or from everywhere. People want to buy substances or services over the web that are not always very, very pleasant for their or political authority. People want to donate to WikiLeaks. People want to donate to political opposition to tyranny. People want to basically buy rings to their lover without being tracked. People want to save money without inflation destroying their wealth or their family wealth for generations, like with the dollars. So the first scenario is people do need this kind of thing. This first scenario is divided in two sub-scenarios. The first part is we can reach this kind of result, which is needed by the people eventually, and people will feel that they need this scenario, generally speaking, only with Bitcoin, which is my position. So I don't think that centralized systems will be able, like Visa or MasterCard, will be able to provide sound money and private money. So they will never be a competition, because being centralized, they will never basically beat us or beat Bitcoin, because they will always have the problem. But the nice thing about these first two scenarios is that if I'm right, then Bitcoin is the only hope to reach this kind of scenario. And then we have to preserve Bitcoin, and we don't have to fear competition, because if I'm right about the scenario, call it 1A, so we need private money and sound money, and the only answer, realistic answer to that is Bitcoin, the only one. So if I'm right in choosing this scenario, then every competition is dead on arrival, because they cannot provide the same user experience, not because of speed or because of easy UX, but because of the fundamental problem of permissionless saving without inflation, or permissionless payment without traceability or de-anonymization or censorship or post-censorship, when the government knows what you paid for, and so it will punish you. It will punish you. So if these things are needed and Bitcoin is the only answer, then there is intrinsically no possibility of competition. Every other more centralized network or alternative solution will lose compared to Bitcoin, because Bitcoin is the only answer. But now let's consider that I'm wrong, and so people still need sound money and private money, but Bitcoin is not the only answer. MasterCard coin can also provide, at least for some amount of time, an alternative to Bitcoin, which is as private or almost as private and as sound. So you can save your wealth of your family in MasterCard coin without being robbed by the government inflation. You can buy with MasterCard coin without people censoring you or tracking you. If that's the case, so I'm wrong about Bitcoin unicity. I don't think I'm wrong for many considerations, but if I'm wrong, then no problem. So what's the problem? If we're going to end up with Bitcoin on one side, covering the first scenario A1, and with any other kind of alternative in scenario A2, then what's the worst case scenario? That I'm wrong, and then we will have freedom from inflation and freedom from censorship with several competing networks. Of course, if these competing networks can provide alternatives, then first of all, I don't think they will be Bcash or Ethereum, because they are too fake decentralized in order to really work as well as the centralized solution can work. The centralized solutions are great for UX because they can evolve very fast. They can be super centralized, so they can have high speed, low cost, fast evolution, but they are very bad at privacy and at hard money protection, because they are easy to control in order to impose traceability and KYC ML or inflation and monetary-based manipulation. So my second scenario is, sure, we can have Bitcoin and we can have alternatives, and alternatives can answer to this need for private money and sound money of the people. So still, what's the point in changing Bitcoin? We should keep Bitcoin safe for the first scenario, and eventually we will get an even better outcome when we can, when everybody's happy and every kind of central banking cryptocurrency is private and sound. So we will use that as well. I mean, basically in that scenario, Bitcoin has magically forced the rest of the world to become like Bitcoin. If that's the scenario, I don't see any problem, except that I would probably have to sell some of my Bitcoin, not at $2 million, but maybe at $2,000. Who cares? That's my basically portfolio allocation problem. It's not a fundamental problem that we should concern about in order to change Bitcoin anyhow. There is a third scenario. So there is A1. We need people that do need privacy and sound money, and only Bitcoin is the answer. There is A2. People that do need private money and sound money, and there are multiple competing answers. Still good, no problem, no reason to change Bitcoin. Let's make them compete, and if Bitcoin loses to competition, that's all good because competition was better. The third scenario is people do not need globally sound money or private money, but only a small niche do need that. Is this the case? I don't think this is the case. I think that the majority of the economic exchanges in the world right now are into the gray market. So I think that the permissionless gray market is bigger than the permissioned white market. So I don't think that's the case, that people do not need to go around censorship and to go around money manipulation. But if that's the case, still, who cares? We should probably keep Bitcoin as an instrument for our niche of libertarian and dark web traders or exchangers and merchants and whatever, and gold bug fanatics. So if normal people is not going to join these two value propositions, then there is no reason to pretend for 2 years that they do, pretending that the reason they should adopt is because it's fast, or it's because it's cheap, or because it's cool with smart contracts and Turing completeness. Fake marketing in order to attract adoption of something that people do not want is not going to end well anyway. So people eventually will leave Bitcoin for something if they don't need decentralization in order to achieve sound money and private money. They will anyway leave Bitcoin when they realize that Visa coin can be even faster because they're centralized, even cheaper because they're centralized, and even more cool and with a huge marketing department, even more than Ethereum. I mean, Ethereum is thriving because much part of the budget they raised with the RCO was used not for development but for marketing. Think about Visa. They can do even more marketing than Ethereum. So there is actually no race in that side. It's like, you're creating some kind of space suit because you think that people is going to go into space, and people is selling some kind of jeans and shirts as an alternative to space suits. So the problem is either people is really going to space, and so they will have to buy the very, very difficult to use, very, very heavy, very, very clumsy space suit you are building, and not the jeans and shirt that your competition is selling. They may not realize the difference now that they are still in the rocket going to the space. But as soon as they open the gate and they go into open space, you can be sure that they will realize the difference. Because if I'm wrong and there is no difference, then no problem. Then we discovered that we didn't need space suits in order to go into the space. We just needed shirts and jeans. And so I would be more than happy to admit that I was wrong, to throw away every kind of research on space suits and to just buy jeans and shirts. And even if you understand that people do not want to go into space at all, then still, if we are the only two fanatics that actually want to go to space, who cares about the fact that other people think that we could go there with the shirts and jeans? We know that we need a space suit. So it was a very long answer, and I'm sorry, but
no,
my point is that logically speaking, there is not such an issue. There is no competition possible for Bitcoin by definition, and if there is, then there is no reason to fear the competition anyway.
I think that was a great answer, and I don't want to keep you too long. I know that you've got other things to do today, but just for a final answer, I wanted to just have you talk about, or just kind of define, Bitcoin maximalism. It's very tied to, the small big block debate. I mean, I don't find a lot of people that would consider themselves necessarily Bitcoin Cash maximalists. Although some people will call themselves Bitcoin maximalists, but are big blockers. But I don't find too many people that do advocate specifically to stick with small blocks for definitely for the time being right now, that aren't maximalists. So if you could kind of give a overview of what maximalism is, I guess it's kind of an ethereal term. That probably means different things to different people, but just kind of a general rough overview, I guess, what it means to you.
Sure. So as you said, it's a word, and every word, especially at the beginning of its use, can have different shapes and meanings. But the way I tend to use it to describe myself, and the way that I think is useful, because it's identify some kind of consistent thinking and consistent philosophy of maximalism. Even if somebody has noticed that maximalism is not the better term, is not the best term, because it means in art that you want more stuff instead of less, which is actually the opposite of Bitcoin maximalist. And they are proposing Bitcoin suprematist, which will have some kind of political color to it. But anyway, Vitalik Buterin coined the expression Bitcoin maximalist in a pejorative way, and we kind of adopted it with pride. And so what does
Is that usually how those things start?
Sorry?
I was saying, isn't that usually how those things usually start?
Yeah. It's more often the way that these kind of things are. So you appropriate of a derogatory term in a proud way. So basically, I will describe Bitcoin maximalism in this way, with actually these three rules. The first rule is everything which is not Bitcoin inside the cryptocurrency environment, which is not based strictly on Bitcoin or improving Bitcoin or working with Bitcoin around Bitcoin, is a scam. And I will try to try to be a little bit more nuanced, but now I'm just declaring the first principle. So first rule: everything which is not Bitcoin inside the Bitcoin derived space, so the blockchain or so private blockchains, altcoins, they are scams. Second rule: every important modification to Bitcoin, which is not super slow, super accepted, super consensual, is a scam. So any important and sudden and controversial modification to Bitcoin is a scam or an attack. And third, which is a question of style than of content, you should not be nice with scammers, and you should not be accommodating or open to compromises or trying to be nice with everybody. You should call out scammers without any kind of periphrasis or nice sugar pill over it. You should be very direct, and you should annoyingly and continuously and pedantically call out every scammers, including the ones in the first two categories. So I think that the reason for this, I don't have time to explain details or about how I came up with these three definitions about Bitcoin maximalism, but I will try to give some kind of maybe I will make some speech about it someday, but I will try to give some very, very fast impression. So basically, first I start from the last part. The reason we should not be nice with scammers is that if Bitcoin is decentralized, it's not protected by the usual systems that we are used to leverage in traditional markets or industry, like people suing scammers or law enforcement protecting people from themselves, like market restriction, regulators, all this kind of stuff. Is by definition disappeared from Bitcoin if Bitcoin's worse. So that means that Bitcoin must be defended from scammers. We have to work more to keep the space free and clean, because usual ways to keep this kind of inevitable situations like scammers, fraudsters, or just con artists or snake oil sellers. All this kind of stuff gets kept somehow under control, not really, in traditional markets by law enforcement and reputation and liability. In Bitcoin, you don't have those stuff, because in the cypherpunk dream, if it succeeds, you don't have global reputation, you don't have physical enforceability, you don't have, mostly, of course I'm speaking as a trend, some corner case you will always have. So for this reason, it's even more important that we keep our ethical and technological bar very, very, very high and not very, very low. So it's not the reason why maximalists are not nice with scammers is not that they are angry people or they are as a personal character they are particularly violent. I myself, I like to get along with people, but it's really a philosophical proposition, the one to stay to compensate the lack of any kind of legacy control with very, very high standards, ethical standards and technical standards. Because, and this is a strictly related problem, because Bitcoin can be it's a social construct, and even if part of it is technological, so it's mathematics and code and hardware, still much part of it, as for any kind of game theory structure, is social. So social taboos and social rules and social and cultural constructs, they can affect, and they are affecting, and they will affect Bitcoin, mostly in defending it from centralization. So creating a culture around Bitcoin is also part of the protocol. So the people behaving in a certain way and reacting to scammer is part of the Bitcoin protocol in the wet space. So we should not get along with scammers. Of course, with some scammers, I cannot avoid to get along. I mean, if I'm a bad maximalist sometimes, because if I see John McAfee, it's so funny to me that I cannot avoid to laugh, and I cannot be angry at him because he's like the Uber scammer, and it's so self-evident that only also BitConnect. I mean, I cannot really be angry at Carlos Matos. I love him, but anytime I talk about or R3SEV or digital assets or Bcash or Ethereum, I call out scammers. And about the first and the second rule, I think that my previous answer somehow explains to you the reasons I think so. But the thing is that basically I don't. We, as maximalists, define it in this very, very narrow way. We don't think that any alternative to Bitcoin could succeed. Bitcoin is somehow an almost irrepeatable experiment for many technological and cybersecurity and ops security and economical and monetary theory reasons. So it's an experiment which is probably impossible to replicate. And there is no reason to change it in order to accommodate adoption, because for the reason I explained before, there is not a race toward adoption. It's like a logically impossible problem. So this is my maximalist manifesto.
Yeah, I think it's funny that you mentioned John. I follow him as well because it's so hilarious to me that he openly just says, "If you get me $150,000, I'll shill your coin." And it still works though. I mean, he'll mention, like the Bitcoin private and all that stuff, and doing like a week long of really bad memes, and it still gives a bump to the price. I guess it works. That's why people pay him. But I mean, it's a heck of a business. So I guess as long as it's working for him, I mean, go for it, John. I guess
Yeah, I see John as an immunization of the system. Like he is the immunitary antigen. So it's not. I don't know about any smart people that will fall for that. So it's not really attacking the kind of target of Bitcoin. Only morons in looking for a quick buck can fall there, but they will fall for any kind of diet solution or multi-level marketing solution. I mean, if they're not falling for McAfee, they would fall for Herbalife or anything else.
Giacomo, I'd like to thank you very much. It was extremely informative. I've actually do have a lot of things I need to think on that you've mentioned and kind of brought up with some of the arguments that I was kind of bringing up and kind of had held on to. So I'm not saying I'm yet a maximalist, but I would say that there were a lot of answers to the questions that I had been running around my head, and I really appreciate your time, especially with the about 4 separate incidences of mess ups between technology and a power outage here. So I thank you again for spending your Saturday with us.
As we said, bandwidth is a limitation, and we should be very, very aware of a worst case scenario about bandwidth. So everything is fine. It was a pleasure for me, and thank you for inviting me.